World history is full of wars fought openly, with tanks, planes, and bullets. But the most dangerous wars are often invisible, silent, and unstoppable. In the past decade, a battle was quietly unfolding. A battle not in the streets, not on the battlefield, but inside the global financial system. A battle that could destroy nations without a single shot being fired. The United States had built an empire unlike any other in history. Not with armies, not with colonies, not with resources. With one simple, yet extraordinarily powerful weapon: the dollar. Every nation that wanted to trade, to borrow, or to survive in the modern economy needed it. The dollar controlled oil, gold, international banking, loans, sanctions, and global commerce. It was the silent king of the world, untouchable, unchallenged, until a nation long underestimated began preparing a counterattack. Russia. World saw Russia as a declining power after the collapse of the Soviet Union, trapped by sanctions and dependent on its natural resources. Yet behind closed doors, Moscow was orchestrating a plan years in the making. They understood that the dollar's greatest strength was also its weakness. The world's complete dependence on it. If a country could disrupt or bypass that system, it could rewrite the rules of power. The first step was observation. Every sanction, every embargo, every financial freeze became a lesson. They saw what happened to Iran in 2012, when it was cut off from SWIFT. Banks froze, economies collapsed, reserves disappeared. Russia realized that SWIFT, a seemingly technical banking system, was the ultimate weapon, a financial nuclear bomb that could destroy an economy silently. For the next decade, Russia quietly built a shield. They accumulated massive gold reserves, ensuring a tangible store of wealth outside the reach of the dollar. They shifted trade agreements from dollars to rubles, euros, and eventually yuan, diversifying their exposure. They built SPFS, an alternative messaging system to SWIFT, and established domestic payment networks to ensure internal stability in the event of sanctions. Meanwhile, energy became a strategic lever. Pipelines stretching across Europe were not just economic assets. They were instruments of control. Nations that relied on Russian gas were vulnerable, and Moscow understood the leverage that dependency gave them. Then came the stage where theory turned into practice. February 26, 2022, marked the first public salvo in what would later be called the secret financial war. 2 days after Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and the European Union severed Russian banks from SWIFT. A nation that once dominated energy, exports, and reserves suddenly had its voice cut off. Analysts predicted total collapse, the ruble would plunge, the economy would crumble, and public unrest would force political submission. Yet nothing happened as expected. The ruble stabilized, the economy adapted, and Russia turned what should have been a knockout blow into account. The secret lay in preparation. Russia had made plans years ahead. When cut off from SWIFT, Moscow demanded that nations pay for energy in rubles. Europe, desperate for gas, had no choice. This forced a surge in demand for Russian currency, stabilizing it even as the world expected it to collapse. Meanwhile, gold reserves acted as a tangible backing for rubles, restoring confidence domestically and internationally. The dollar, which had once seemed invincible, faced a subtle tremor. Nations began realizing that dependency on the dollar was a vulnerability. If America could freeze Russia's reserves overnight, could it do the same to them? Governments in Asia, Africa, the Middle East, and Latin America began to quietly explore alternatives, bilateral currency deals, and trade arrangements that bypassed the dollar. The invisible war had begun, and the first shock waves were just the start. Behind the headlines and breaking news, Russia's strategies were slowly reshaping global finance. Central banks increased gold purchases to hedge against dollar risk. Nations agreed to local currency swaps to reduce exposure. Payment systems outside SWIFT were tested and refined. The world, for the first time in decades, was starting to realize that a unipolar financial order was not permanent. Russia's countermeasures did more than protect its economy. They challenged the very perception of dollar dominance. The real weapon in this war wasn't rubles, gold, or even SP. It was the psychological impact, the fear that the dollar could be weaponized and that no country was truly safe. Fear spreads faster than markets. Fear drives nations to diversify, hedge, and create alternative systems. And fear is exactly what Moscow induced. Meanwhile, BRICS, once just a political acronym, began to emerge as a financial coalition. Russia, China, India, Brazil, and South Africa, later joined by several Middle Eastern and African nations, started building a multipolar financial world. This coalition controlled a combined population exceeding the Western world, access to vast natural resources, gold, energy, manufacturing, and growing influence in trade. They did not confront the dollar with aggression, but with alternatives. Slowly, methodically, they created a world where dependence on the U.S. currency was no longer necessary. The consequences were immediate. Central banks reassessed reserves. Trade agreements shifted away from the dollar. Digital currency adoption accelerated. Commodity-backed trade increased. Energy contracts diversified into multiple currencies. The financial map of the world, once dominated by a single axis, was beginning to fragment. Yet, despite all these strategic shifts, the dollar did not collapse overnight. Its power remained strong, but cracks appeared in its facade. The very reliance that had been its strength, the global trust in its supremacy, had become its weakness. Russia's actions had exposed this vulnerability. The implications were profound. Financially isolated nations could still survive and even thrive with careful planning. Alternative systems could emerge. Dependence was no longer mandatory. The global financial ecosystem was entering a period of instability and uncertainty unlike any the modern world had seen. And the war was far from over. Russia's counterattack had shown that preparation, patience, and leverage could neutralize even the most dominant financial weapon. The invisible war continued, hidden from most observers, shaping policy decisions, trade routes, currency agreements, and central bank strategies worldwide. As Europe struggled with energy dependency and the West grappled with the consequences of sanctions, new alliances formed quietly. The lessons were clear. Money is power, trust is fragile, and domination is never permanent. The secret war had rewritten the rules of engagement. Nations began preparing for a world where the dollar might not dictate their survival. Alternatives, hedges, and strategic reserves became critical. Moscow's defiance was no longer an isolated act. It was a blueprint for resistance, a lesson for any country seeking financial sovereignty. The implications reached far beyond Russia. Countries previously compliant with U.S. financial hegemony reconsidered their positions. Nations in Africa, Asia, and Latin America began testing systems that would allow them to bypass the dollar and trade in reserves. The invisible war expanded. Every transaction, every agreement, every contract became a potential battlefield. The dollar, once untouchable, faced challenges on multiple fronts. The new reality was that a multipolar financial system was emerging, one where power could be decentralized, alliances reformed, and influence measured not just by military strength, but by strategic financial positioning. The global economic order, once assumed immutable, had cracks that only a nation with foresight, patience, and leverage could exploit. Russia's role in this transformation was not aggressive, but tactical. By carefully maneuvering around restrictions, creating alternatives, and leveraging energy dependency, it forced a reconsideration of the dollar's dominance and accelerated a shift that many believed would take decades. The lesson was chilling. Domination can be challenged, and no system, no matter how powerful, is invulnerable. This war, silent yet devastating, had only begun. And the first phase demonstrated one undeniable truth: preparation, strategic patience, and understanding the vulnerabilities of a system can allow even a seemingly weaker nation to challenge the most powerful financial empire in history. While headlines focused on tanks, missiles, and sanctions, the real battle was invisible, strategic, and far-reaching. And it was changing the world in ways few understood. And the ripple effects were already being felt across continents, in capitals, in trading floors, and inside central banks. This was the hidden war of the 21st century, and its outcome would redefine not just Russia, the US, or Europe, but the very structure of global finance itself. The world had glimpsed the beginning of a new financial era. The dollar, long assumed unchallenged, was showing cracks, and nations were quietly testing alternatives. Russia had survived, adapted, and counterattacked, but this was only the first act. What followed was a deeper, more complex reordering of global finance. Nations previously comfortable under U.S. hegemony now began questioning: how secure are their reserves? How safe are their banks? What happens if the dollar, weaponized as it was against Russia, can be turned against them? The fear spread quietly, like a slow-moving storm. Central banks began to diversify, moving away from dollars and investing in gold, yuan, rubles, and other alternatives. They established bilateral agreements to settle trade in local currencies. Financial engineers created systems outside the West's influence. Parallel banking networks emerged. Digital currencies, once niche, suddenly became practical tools for nations to escape sanctions, bypass global restrictions, and preserve sovereignty. Meanwhile, Russia continued to consolidate its leverage. Energy pipelines were expanded, and gas exports were redirected to willing partners in Asia and the Middle East. Each deal, each contract, reinforced Russia's ability to survive economic isolation. European dependency on Russian energy became a subtle lever in international negotiations. By forcing payments in rubles, Moscow stabilized its currency while simultaneously challenging the perception of the dollar as the ultimate safe haven. But it wasn't only about energy. Russia strategically used its natural resources, gold reserves, and alliances to build a multipolar financial network. BRICS, once a collection of emerging economies, evolved into a formidable coalition, joined by key Middle Eastern and African nations. Collectively, they controlled vast populations, energy supplies, manufacturing capacity, and precious metals. By coordinating currency swaps, trade agreements, and alternative banking systems, these nations created a blueprint for survival outside the dollar-dominated system. The ripple effects were profound. Global trade, once tethered tightly to the US dollar, began to fragment. Local currencies were now accepted in cross-border settlements. Oil contracts were increasingly denominated in euros, rubles, or yuan. Commodity-backed currencies started to gain credibility. For the first time in decades, the dollar's monopoly was being challenged not by war, but by strategy, foresight, and coordinated economic action. Yet the United States remained unaware of the full scope. Sanctions, once assumed to be decisive, became less effective as nations developed alternative channels. Banks outside SWIFT flourished. Trade routes adapted. Hidden financial networks expanded. The world was learning a difficult lesson. Dominance depends on compliance, and when compliance is broken, power falters. At the same time, technological evolution accelerated these shifts. Digital currencies, blockchain settlement platforms, and decentralized financial instruments provided the infrastructure to bypass traditional systems. Russia's own SPFS network evolved alongside these innovations, allowing rapid adaptation in real time to sanctions, trade blockages, and international pressure. The stage was set for a historic transformation. Not only were traditional financial hierarchies being challenged, but the very concept of currency dominance was under threat. The dollar was no longer the undisputed king. It was a strategic instrument vulnerable to manipulation. The implications extended far beyond geopolitics. Global businesses had to reconsider risk. Investors demanded hedges. Commodity markets fluctuated as nations sought to reduce dollar dependency. Governments quietly revised economic strategies. Economies once considered secure realized they were dependent on a fragile system controlled by foreign policy, not market forces. Meanwhile, Russia used its position to quietly influence the emerging multipolar order. By negotiating energy contracts, infrastructure projects, and financial agreements outside Western frameworks, it strengthened ties with nations seeking independence from the dollar. China expanded its Belt and Road Initiative, integrating trade networks with alternative currencies and digital payment systems. India diversified energy and commodity imports. Middle Eastern nations hedged reserves and participated in BRICS-led initiatives. Each move slowly eroded the dominance of the dollar and demonstrated the power of coordinated, patient strategy. Even Europe, heavily dependent on Russian energy, was forced to rethink policies. Sanctions, while politically symbolic, could not sever dependence entirely. Nations realized the fragility of supply chains, the vulnerability of financial systems, and the danger of over-reliance on a single currency. This revelation accelerated investment in alternative energy, local currencies, and regional partnerships. The invisible war continued, silent yet pervasive. Each trade agreement, currency swap, or commodity deal became part of a larger chessboard. Every nation's choice could tilt influence in unexpected directions. The conflict was no longer about immediate gains. It was about shaping a financial world resilient to coercion and control. The psychological impact was profound. Trust in the dollar, once unshakable, began to waver. Nations that had never questioned the system began exploring options previously deemed unnecessary or risky. The U.S., despite its global influence, faced the reality that its financial weaponry had limits. Dependency had created vulnerabilities in allies as well as adversaries. Meanwhile, Russia's approach remained calculated, avoiding direct confrontation, leveraging energy, gold, and alternative systems. It strengthened influence quietly. Sanctions, intended to cripple, inadvertently showcased Russia's resilience and encouraged others to follow its example. Across the globe, financial institutions analyzed new risk scenarios. Central banks developed alternative clearing mechanisms. Private enterprises explored settlements in rubles, yuan, and euros. Gold returned as a critical hedge. Digital and commodity-backed instruments gained unprecedented legitimacy. The seeds of a multipolar financial system had been sown, and while the world remained distracted by military headlines, the structural shift continued largely unnoticed. The dollar's traditional supremacy was no longer guaranteed. Its psychological dominance, economic influence, and ability to weaponize the global system were under pressure. The lesson was clear. Even the most dominant system could be challenged with preparation, leverage, and strategy. Russia's financial war had revealed this truth. In the years following 2022, these shifts became more pronounced. BRICS expanded influence, forming agreements that bypassed the dollar entirely. Gold-backed currencies gained traction. Digital currencies began settlement trials across borders. Trade in local currencies became common among developing nations. The old system of global finance, once thought permanent, faced erosion. The battle between the dollar and its challengers continued silently, decisively, and strategically. Every decision, every contract, every payment had consequences. Nations realized survival required diversification, foresight, and independence. The financial war became a central axis around which global geopolitics rotated. Military conflicts, diplomatic negotiations, and trade deals were all now influenced by the lessons of February 2022. And the question lingered: if a nation like Russia could survive and thrive under sanctions, isolation, and economic pressure, how secure was the global reliance on the dollar? Meanwhile, the ripple effects spread. Investors adjusted portfolios, gold demand surged, energy markets shifted, emerging economies accelerated alternative financial networks. Even allies of the U.S. reconsidered exposure. The invisible war was redefining strategy across continents. The dollar's once unassailable dominance was being questioned openly and quietly. The lessons of Russia's financial resilience became a blueprint for other nations seeking autonomy, and the implications for global governance, international banking, and strategic economic planning were profound. The world had entered a new era, one where money, trust, and influence intertwined to create power far beyond military might. The silent war had become the defining struggle of the 21st century, and Russia, underestimated by many, had rewritten the rules of engagement. Its strategies revealed vulnerabilities, offered alternatives, and reshaped the perception of what financial dominance truly meant. The war was invisible, ongoing, and global. Every contract, currency, trade, and transaction carried weight. Every nation had to choose whether to align with the old order or adapt to the emerging multipolar reality. The stakes were not just political. They were existential. Survival depended on understanding the hidden mechanisms of power and learning the lessons of strategy, patience, and resilience demonstrated by Russia. And while the headlines would focus on military conflicts, the real battle, the battle for control, independence, and financial sovereignty would continue silently, shaping the future of nations, economies, and the balance of global influence for decades to come.